December 13, 1945. After being convicted of crimes involving the ill treatment and murder of Jewish prisoners, Irma Grese faced the gallows at Hamelin Prison, where she reportedly walked to her harrowing execution with a cold, calm demeanor. Here are some of the craziest female executions of all time. April 10, 1955. Ruth Ellis commits a crime that leaves many in disbelief. However, what was most shocking wasn't her crime, but the way she was executed. Born in Wales, 1926, Ruth grows up in a working-class family and would seek a better life in London. Strikingly beautiful and charming, she would work as a nightclub hostess, which introduced her to a glamorous yet dangerous world of wealthy men, alcohol, and tumultuous relationships. In 1953, Ruth met David Blakely, a handsome man but also a volatile race car driver. Their relationship was passionate, but eventually it would become toxic, being marred by frequent arguments, infidelity, and physical abuse. Despite the troubles they faced, though, Ruth seemed unable to cut ties with David. However, the relationship spiraled out of control when David began avoiding her, and Ruth discovered he was seeing another woman. On Easter Sunday, April 10, 1955, everything came to a head. Ruth, fueled by jealousy and despair, arms herself with a .38 caliber Smith & Wesson Victory model revolver and waits outside the pub in Hampstead where David was drinking. When he comes out, Ruth confronts him and, in a fit of rage, fires 5 shots. David's hit 4 times and dies almost instantly. Ruth confesses to the crime without hesitation. Her trial was swift, and despite evidence of her abusive relationship with David and her mental state, she would show little remorse. The jury would take less than a half an hour to find her guilty of murder. Under the strict laws of the time, a murder conviction carried an automatic death sentence. July 13, 1955, Ruth was hanged at Holloway Prison, becoming the last woman executed in the UK at just 28 years old. Public's reaction was intense, with many arguing that her execution was unjust given the abuse she had endured. The case sparked widespread debate about capital punishment, specifically for women, and cases involving domestic violence. Anne Boleyn's story is one of love, betrayal, and political drama, changing the course of history. We take you to 1501 England, where we have Anne, an intelligent, charming, ambitious woman, and she catches the eye of King Henry VIII, who had become so infatuated with her that he was willing to overturn his kingdom. At the time, Henry was already married to Catherine of Aragon, but their union had failed because she couldn't produce a male heir. Anne had refused to become the king's mistress, though, insisting she would only give herself to him as his wife. Well, that bold stance led to the English Reformation, as Henry broke away from the Catholic Church and then establishes the Church of England and annuls his marriage to Catherine. By 1533, Anne and Henry were married, and she was crowned queen. Now, Anne gave birth to Elizabeth in September 1533, who would later become one of England's greatest monarchs. But her failure to produce a male heir put her position in jeopardy. Henry's affections began to wane, and Anne made powerful enemies in court. Her outspoken nature and sharp tongue alienated many, while rumors of her alleged infidelity began to swirl. By 1536, Anne would be arrested and charged with adultery, incest with her brother, George Boleyn, and treason. These accusations, likely fabricated, were orchestrated by Thomas Cromwell, Henry's chief minister, to remove her and secure a new marriage for the king. Anne was tried and found guilty, though evidence against her was weak. On May 19, 1536, Anne was executed at the Tower of London. In a rare gesture, Henry ordered a skilled French swordsman for her beheading instead of the traditional axe. This act was meant to ensure a quicker, more merciful death. Dressed in a gray gown and white coif, Anne faced her fate with dignity, delivering a final speech praising the king and accepting her death with grace. Now, her death marked a dark chapter in Tudor's history, but her legacy endured through her daughter, Elizabeth I, who became a symbol of strength and resilience. Anne Boleyn's tragic end continues to fascinate as a tale of ambition, love, and betrayal in one of history's most turbulent eras. December 31st, 1612, Elizabeth Báthory was arrested for some of the worst crimes ever known to man, crimes that gave her the name Blood Countess. Born in 1560 into a powerful Hungarian noble family, Elizabeth had a privileged upbringing. She was well educated, fluent in several languages, and married to Ferenc Nadasdy, a military hero. However, behind this aristocratic facade was a woman whose alleged crimes were pretty horrifying. After her husband's death in 1604, rumors about her cruelty began spreading. She reportedly tortured and killed servant girls and young peasants lured to her castle with promises of work. This would include beatings, burnings, and even biting chunks of flesh from her victims. And then stories came out that she would bathe in their blood to keep young, though historians believe that this might be an exaggeration from later accounts. Elizabeth's crimes would come to light when the daughters of lesser nobles, sent to her for education, began disappearing. In 1610, King Matthias II ordered an investigation. What authorities found was shocking. Mutilated bodies, imprisoned victims, and detailed accounts of her sadistic methods from over 300 witnesses. The exact number of her victims remains uncertain, with estimates ranging from 80 to as high as 650. In December 1612, Elizabeth was arrested, along with her accomplices. Now, they executed her servants but saved her because of her noble status, and instead gave her a lifelong imprisonment. They put her in this tiny room in her castle, with only a small slot for food and air. Elizabeth had spent 4 years in solitary confinement until her death in 1614. Official records claim that she had passed away naturally, though the eerie circumstances of her life and crimes continue to inspire fascination and fear. Was Elizabeth Báthory a bloodthirsty killer, or was she the victim of a political conspiracy to seize her wealth and power? While some historians lean toward the latter, the sheer volume of testimonies and evidence paints a grim picture. In May 1945, Louise Peete was convicted for gruesomely murdering her employer, Margaret Logan. Born in 1880 in Bienville, Louisiana, Louise grew up with a magnetic personality and an air of sophistication. She would use her talents to charm her way through life, but beneath the surface would lie her dark side. Her first major crime unfolded in 1920 when she befriended Jacob Denton, a wealthy mining executive in Los Angeles. Denton was captivated by her wit and charm and allowed her to stay in his luxurious mansion while he attended to business. Shortly after, he vanished. When questioned, Louise gave bizarre excuses, claiming he'd gone into hiding due to a disfiguring accident, although the truth was far more sinister. Months later, Denton's decomposed body was found in his basement, shot through the neck, and during his absence, Louise had lived in his home, spent his money, and maintained her lavish lifestyle. 1921, Louise was convicted of murder and sentenced to life, serving 18 years before being paroled in 1939. So free again, she would quickly revert to her old ways. She charmed her way into the life of Margaret Logan, an elderly widow in Pasadena. Louise had gained her trust and eventually moved into her home, taking control of her finances. Then Margaret disappeared. Authorities found her strangled body buried in the backyard, a chilling echo of Louise's previous crime. This time, though, Louise's silver tongue failed her. Convicted of Margaret's murder in 1944, she became the first woman in California sentenced to die in over a decade. While on death row, she remained calm, claiming innocence to the very end. Even prison staff noted her unsettling charm, which seemed out of place for someone awaiting execution. On April 11, 1947, Louise Peete was executed in California's gas chamber. Her calm composure and her final moments only added to this eerie legacy. She remains one of the most infamous female criminals in U.S. history, a femme fatale whose charm and cunning hid a heart of darkness. The year is 1980, and Judy Buenoano horrifyingly kills her own son, Michael Buenoano. However, it wouldn't be until the attempted murder of her next victim that her true motive came to light. Born Jedias Welty in 1943 in Texas, Judy entered a troubled childhood, marked by the death of her mother and a very turbulent family lifestyle. But no one could have predicted how her later years would spiral into a series of calculated, cold-blooded crimes that earned her the nickname the Black Widow. Judy's first known crime came to light after the death of her husband, James Goodyear, in 1971. James was an Air Force sergeant and had appeared to die of natural causes. Grief-stricken Judy quickly cashed in on his life insurance policy and moved on with her life. However, investigators later discovered that James's death was anything but natural. Judy had laced his meals with arsenic and slowly poisoned him. Tragically, her next victim was her own son, Michael. In 1980, Judy forced Michael, who was partially paralyzed, into a canoe and deliberately tipped it over during a fishing trip. Michael drowned while Judy swam to safety, later collecting another hefty insurance payout. The pattern was now undeniable. Judy targeted her loved ones for financial gain. The reign of terror wouldn't stop here. She would also attempt to murder her fiancé, John Gentry. In 1983, Judy had been slipping him vitamins laced with poison, but John had survived and also became suspicious. His testimony, combined with mounting evidence, unraveled Judy's web of deceit. Authorities had exhumed James Goodyear's body and found arsenic in his system, sealing Judy's fate. In 1984, Judy Buenoano was convicted of murdering her husband and son and attempting to murder her fiancé. She was sentenced to death, making her the first woman to face the electric chair in Florida since 1848. Judy spent over a decade on death row, surprisingly maintaining her innocence. On March 30th, 1998, Judy was executed. She refused a final meal, opting for a simple cup of black coffee. Witnesses said that her execution was unnervingly stoic, as she showed no emotion while the current ended her very existence. Marie Antoinette has to be one of history's most infamous queens, remembered for her extravagant lifestyle and tragic end. Born back in 1755 as an Austrian archduchess, she became Queen of France at the young age of 19 after marrying Louis XVI. And while she lived in luxury at her palace of Versailles, her people were in abject poverty, and that imbalance would ultimately seal her fate. Marie's reputation for excess became legendary. Tales of her lavish spending on gowns, jewels, and grand parties spread like wildfire. She was even wrongly credited with the infamous quote, "Let them eat cake," when told the French peasants had no bread. The queen became a scapegoat for everything wrong in France's monarchy, earning nicknames like Madame Deficit. And by the late 1780s, France was in a crisis. Food shortages, skyrocketing taxes, and widespread unrest ignited the French Revolution. The royal family became prisoners in their own palace as angry mobs demanded change. Marie Antoinette was particularly loathed for her supposed indifference to the people's suffering and her perceived loyalty to Austria, her homeland. In 1791, the royal family attempted to flee France in disguise but were caught and brought right back to Paris. It was the beginning of the end. Louis XVI was executed in January 1793, and Marie followed later that year. By then, her life had completely unraveled. Her children were taken from her, and she endured months of imprisonment, humiliation, and what we call a sham trial. Marie was accused of high treason, depleting the French treasury, and even abusing her own son, an accusation so vile it brought her to tears in court. Despite her pleas, the Revolutionary Tribunal sentenced her to death on October 16, 1793. At the age of 37, Marie Antoinette faced the guillotine. Stripped of her royal finery, they put her in a simple white dress and paraded her through the streets of Paris in an open cart. The once glamorous queen was met with cheers from an angry crowd. When she reached the scaffold, she accidentally stepped onto the executioner's foot and famously said, "Pardon me, sir, I meant not to do it." Moments later, the blade fell, ending the life of the once glamorous queen. Marie Antoinette's story remains a powerful symbol of excess, revolution, and the dramatic fall of a monarchy. Her life and death serve as a cautionary tale of how power, privilege, and public perception can collide with devastating consequences. In 1974, Velma Barfield brutally killed her own mother, Lillian Bullard. However, this would be one of many horrific murders she commits, leading her to the point of no return. Born in 1932 in South Carolina, Velma grows up in a strict religious household. Her life started off pretty unremarkably. She marries young, raises a family, and seemed to embody the Southern homemaker ideal. But behind those closed doors, her life was unraveling in ways no one could have ever imagined. Tragedy struck with her first husband. husband, Thomas Burke, dying in a suspicious house fire in 1969. Velma quickly remarries, but her second husband, Jennings Barfield, mysteriously dies a year later. At the time, no one's questioning anything, with Velma playing the grieving widow perfectly. Now, things take a darker turn in the 1970s, when Velma's health began to fail, and she had developed an addiction to prescription drugs. To fund her habit, she starts forging checks, stealing from loved ones, and eventually resorts to poisoning those who stand in her way. Now, Velma's weapon of choice was arsenic, and her victims included her own mother, Lillian Bullard, and her boyfriend, Stuart Taylor. She laced their food and drinks, watching as they would succumb to agonizing illnesses, while she just played the loving caretaker. Now, her crimes finally caught up with her in 1978. After Taylor's death, investigators grew suspicious and exhumed the bodies of her victims, finding traces of arsenic. Velma confessed to killing 6 people, claiming she hadn't meant to cause suffering, just to fix her problems. Her chilling lack of remorse shocked the most seasoned detectives. In 1978, Velma Barfield was convicted of Taylor's murder and sentenced to death. Now, while on death row, she became a born-again Christian and gained supporters who campaigned for clemency, arguing she had reformed. But her pleas couldn't erase the horrific nature of her crimes. On November 2, 1984, Velma became the first woman executed in the U.S. since 1962 and the first in modern times to die by lethal injection. She spent her final moments praying with the chaplain, showing no signs of fear. Her last meal, the simple snack of cheese doodles and a Coca-Cola. Velma's story does remain a chilling reminder of how evil can hide behind the most unassuming faces. She was a grandmother, a Sunday school teacher, and a serial killer, a paradox that still leaves true crime enthusiasts speechless. In 1917, they had arrested Margareta Zelli for crimes related to treason. However, what was most unnerving was her boldness and composure in the face of her gruesome execution. Born back in 1876 in the Netherlands, Margareta had a difficult childhood marked by her parents' divorce and then her mother's death. She married young, hoping for stability. But her marriage to an abusive officer stationed in Indonesia was anything but happy. Seeking freedom, she reinvented herself as Báthory, a seductive dancer who captivated Europe with her exotic performances. By the early 1900s, Báthory had become a household name. Her stage name, which means Eye of the Day in Malay, added to her mystique. She became a courtesan, mingling with wealthy men and military officers who adored her. When World War I broke out, Báthory's glamorous world began to crumble. Her high-profile lifestyle required money, and she took on lovers from both sides of the conflict. This made her a prime target for espionage. In 1916, German officials paid her to spy for them, but Báthory wasn't exactly a skilled secret agent. She provided little useful information, focusing more on her romances than her missions, claiming she only accepted money as gifts from lovers, not as payment for treason. However, the French government, desperate to make some example out of somebody, saw her as the perfect scapegoat. In 1917, Báthory was arrested and put on trial. The evidence against her was circumstantial at best, but her reputation as a seductress worked against her. The court painted her as this femme fatale who had betrayed her country for money, and as a result, she was sentenced to death. On October 15, 1917, Báthory faced the grim fate of a firing squad wearing a tailored suit. She reportedly refused a blindfold and stared at her executioners in their eyes. Her last words were said to be, "I am ready," and then she died as she had lived, bold and unflinching. We take you to December 13th, 1945, and after being convicted of crimes involving the ill-treatment and murder of Jewish prisoners, Irma Grese headed to the gallows at Hamelin Prison as she walked to face her grim fate. However, her composure and calmness would be totally unsettling. Born in 1923 in Germany, Grese grew up in a strict, rural family. Leaving school at just 15, she found herself drawn to Nazi ideology during the rise of Hitler. By her early 20s, she had joined the SS Schutzstaffel, quickly rose through the ranks to become one of the most feared female guards in Nazi concentration camps. Now, Grese worked at Ravensbrück, Auschwitz, and finally, Bergen-Belsen. At Auschwitz, she was notorious for sadistic behavior, earning her nicknames like the Hyena of Auschwitz. Standing out with her blonde hair and youthful appearance, she defied the stereotype of what pure evil could look like. This woman would unleash unimaginable horrors. Survivors testified she carried a whip and pistol, which she used to torment prisoners at will. She was known to beat, maim, and even kill for her own amusement. And one of her most disturbing habits would be selecting prisoners for the gas chamber, often while laughing and taunting them. Irma would then thrive on the power she held over life and death, as she embodied the worst of humanity. Now, when the Allies liberated Bergen-Belsen in 1945, Grese, just 21 years old at the time, was arrested along with other SS personnel. During the subsequent Belsen trial, survivors recounted her acts of cruelty in chilling detail. She did remain defiant throughout, showing no remorse and denying responsibility for her actions, claiming she was simply following orders. The court, however, saw through those excuses. Convicted of war crimes, Grese was sentenced to death. Her youth and gender didn't save her. The sheer brutality of her actions made her one of the few women condemned to hang. On December 13, 1945, Irma Grese faced the gallows at Hamelin Prison. She reportedly walked to her execution with a cold, calm demeanor, refusing a blindfold, and as the noose was placed around her neck, she simply said, "Schnell," urging the executioner to get on with it. Moments later, her life ended, bringing to a close one of the darkest chapters of Nazi atrocity. May 22, 2005, while working for a family after her relocation to Saudi Arabia in search of a job, her employer's 4-month-old child, Naif al-Kuthaibi, died while in Rizana Nafeek's care, leading her to a flawed trial that changed the course of her life for the worst. Born in 1988 in a small village in Sri Lanka, Nafeek grew up in poverty, which would make her seek work abroad to support her family. In 2005, at just 17 years old, she travels to Saudi Arabia on a forged passport that claimed she was 23. Rizana finds work as a housemaid for a Saudi family and was tasked with typical domestic chores and caring for their infant son. Tragically, within weeks of her arrival, the baby in her care died. What happened next remains unclear. According to Rizana, the child choked while being bottle-fed, and she desperately tried to save him. However, the grieving parents accused her of intentional strangulation, and she was promptly arrested. What followed next was a flawed legal process. Rizana, who didn't speak Arabic, was interrogated without an interpreter and reportedly coerced into signing a confession. She later retracted it, maintaining her innocence, but the damage was already done. In 2007, she was convicted of murder and sentenced to death. Now, the case sparked international outrage. Human rights organizations argued that she had been a minor at the time of the incident, making her execution a violation of international law. Critics also pointed out the lack of legal representation and unreliable confession. The Sri Lankan government and global activists pled for clemency, but their efforts fell on deaf ears. On January 9, 2013, despite appeals and protests, Rizana's execution was carried out in Saudi Arabia. She was beheaded in public, a practice common under Saudi law. Her death shocked the world and reignited debates about the treatment of migrant workers and the fairness of the Saudi justice system.